Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and host of the 35 West podcast.
Was how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Ryan Berg, the Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. In early December, the European Union and the Southern Common Market, better known as MERCOSUR, reached an agreement on a trade deal. This announcement represented the culmination of more than 2 decades of negotiations between the EU and Mercosur countries, which had progressed off and on since 1999. Bringing together 2 markets totaling over 700 million people, the agreement would create the largest free trade area in the world and connect South America's agricultural powerhouses to Europe's manufacturing hubs. The agreement was also reached under the shadow of an incoming Trump administration in the United States, with the threat of tariffs prompting countries to search for new ways of insulating themselves. To help us unpack these developments, we are very pleased to be joined by Lauri Tähtinen, a non-resident senior associate with the CSIS Americas program. In this episode, we will reflect on the implications of the deal, as well as some of the lingering challenges that threaten to scupper the agreement, even as it nears the finish line. Thanks for joining us today, Lauri.
Great to be here, Ryan.
Lauri, we've seen EU-MERCOSUR near finalization in the past, only to be put on ice once more. What makes this moment different, and why has it taken so long to hammer out?
Yes, you're right to point to the fact that this has taken over a quarter century now to get to this point. Something that was launched as an effort in June 1999, supposedly concluded 20 years later. And here we are still talking about it as another iteration of the deal is on the table. I think, it's probably easiest to start from why right now we're seeing some progress. I mean, there's a lot of pressure right now, geopolitics, external pressure. Both parties feel the pressure of China right now. They're also unsure what global trade will look like in this year, 2025 and going ahead. Obviously, Washington plays a part in those calculations. So it's really a policy of diversification right now. Also, there's an internal element to this, an internal element in Mercosur, internal element within the EU. Within the EU, we saw first that Germany, despite its vote against EU car tariffs on Chinese vehicles, had to accept those and just basically move along with that policy. Right now, France remains the most vocal and important opponent of the EU-MERCOSUR deal, but it is also looking like France may have to come to terms and accept that this agreement may pass. So that's the EU side. Similarly, on the Mercosur side, Lula, as president of Brazil, has a long-term commitment to Mercosur as a Brazilian exercising global influence. And for him, the ability to hammer this deal out would be a sign that Brazil is being taken seriously in the world. And also, Brazil is able to exercise influence over its own neighbors, but also on a global stage. Own neighbors meaning primarily Argentina and Javier Milei in Argentina, despite being sometimes very critical against Mercosur as such, has been less critical of this agreement with the EU. So there's also a lot of pressure to save Mercosur as such, and that this agreement is a way of actually, moving towards that objective. So there are internal and external elements at play here. At the same time, why has it taken this long? It really hasn't been the main priority, at least not for Brussels. It's very clear that along the way, investment agreements with China, TTIP with the United States, trade agreement with India, even more successful efforts such as Canada and Vietnam were considered more important than this trade agreement. And that's something that needs to be set up front, because otherwise nothing would take 25 years, if we were looking at a priority. Similarly, Brazil has always tried to work within the WTO system, or at least likes to think of itself as one of the most important actors on that stage, and has felt less pressure to open up in the form of free trade agreements. But now that the WTO is in a place that's not to Brazil's liking, very much at a standstill, Brazil is also feeling that maybe now they need to start looking at the world in terms of one free trade agreement at the time. And for them, on the other hand, this has always been the biggest deal at the table. EU-MERCOSUR on the Mercosur side is the biggest possible deal. So there's a slight imbalance when you look at these two different perspectives.
Let's dig into the deal as it currently stands, Lauri, and some of the implications of these two major free trade areas joining forces. Now, one of the key reservations from the European Union side during the 2019 round of negotiations concerned environmental protections. How has this question been addressed in the revised iteration of this agreement?
Just stepping back a little to 2019, for those who haven't watched this process incredibly closely, when the agreement was concluded in 2019, within weeks of that, there was a lot of alarm in Europe over the first burning season of the Amazon under President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. And it's useful to not to say that it's simply instrumentalized or weaponized from the perspective of the European Union, but it's useful to remember that this concern has also played a large part in simply stamping down on the agreement more broadly. However, this time around, the parties came to an agreement that there needs to be a shared commitment to implementing the Paris Agreement on climate change, and that if any party were to step away or leave the Paris Treaty, for example, Javier Milei sometimes has been suggesting that he might do such a thing, then that would force urgent consultations between the EU and Mercosur. So the thinking is that trade is now increasingly tied, at the very least, to membership in the Paris Agreement. And then there are some details when it comes to how in practice this will work if somebody still remains a party to the agreement but doesn't seem to be living up to its spirit, how that will play out. But that's the sort of basic thrust of it. This trade agreement is now tied to the Paris process. I mean, obviously, Bolsonaro along the way during his presidency also had many things to say about the Paris Agreement, and that lays in the background right here now. But having it included in the agreement does seem like something that has been included to make sure that not only the reservations of France and President Emmanuel Macron, but also a large body of other Europeans have been taken into account, and they're now part of the deal.
Let's talk about some of the economic benefits that consumers and businesses in both regions can expect once it enters into force. As we mentioned, this deal will bring together two major trading blocs, and it promises to create one of the largest free trade areas in the world. However, some of the estimates that I've seen, Lauri, of additional economic growth as a result of this agreement have been relatively modest. So what can the approximate benefits to consumers and businesses in the regions be as this agreement enters into force?
Yes, I mean, the range is usually in some single-digit billions. That's what people are able to promise. 4 billion of euros, more or less the same in dollars, tends to be the number that is often thrown around. It's difficult to say because some of these figures have already been placed in 2019. The extent to which world trade has now shifted, but we're still seeing some of those numbers being similar. It's very difficult to see where that might go. Also, there is this sense that this agreement may be coming even a little too late to sort of fend off the challenge of Chinese imports, both within the EU and the Mercosur. So the estimate game is very, very difficult right now. One of the things that's really important, and one of the things that was driving this home for Europeans, is that now Brazilian exports of different kinds of raw materials, such as nickel, copper, aluminium, germanium, gallium, a long list of different kinds of raw materials, won't have any taxes on them. And this is a way of securing those kinds of raw materials as well as agricultural goods going forward, not only from Brazil, but also from Argentina. Europe has gone through a couple of different resource scarcity shocks as a result of both the pandemic and the Ukraine war. And really just sort of fortifying supply chains is one of the main things that's on the agenda. Another thing that European industry in particular is looking at is the ability to export electric vehicles to Brazil and Argentina in the future. And the rate for those is going down faster than for old internal combustion engine vehicles, which actually take 18 years to reach zero, which is an incredibly long time, as I think everybody could appreciate. So yes, I think this is a deal that's very difficult to hype up at this stage with mostly economic benefits in mind. And it more has to do with the fact that whatever shocks come the way of either of the parties here, they will be prepared to face those shocks from a different position than they would be without this deal.
Now, in spite of some of the progress we've seen in December of 2024, it's my understanding that there remains some opposition to this agreement particularly from the European agricultural sector. What are some of the remaining pain points of the deal, and what are the chances that they endanger the agreement? This is an area where Latin Americanists can learn from you, Lauri, because sometimes the politics of the European Union seem to us Latin Americanists to be quite a difficult labyrinth to understand.
Absolutely. So one of the things that's being done here is that the trade element and the more broader cooperation agreement has been split within Europe. This has been done to the Canadian deal, has been done in other deals along the way. The one with Chile that the EU has. It's a way of making sure that the trade part can enter into force, even if the broader cooperation agreement does not. This is a little tricky because at the same time in the parliaments in Latin America, the Brazilian Congress, for example, will vote on the whole deal. And that's the way it looks like right now. Basically, it's a situation where two parties are voting on two different deals. In one case, it's the whole package, as it will be the case in Brasilia. And then on the other hand, in Europe, the vote will go ahead most likely only on the trade package. So yes, it's a very complicated picture. And it's made more complicated by the fact that oftentimes many of the pressure groups that act against trade agreements in Europe, much of the material that they would like to see pass is actually part of the broader cooperation agreement. But the broader cooperation agreement would have to be passed by all European countries in their parliaments, which is not something that we are seeing happening anymore and seems very unlikely in this case as well. So for the deal to fall, we need to see 4 states that represent at least 35% of the EU population blocking the agreement. France is already saying that it will continue moving in that direction. Maybe Poland. Poland has voiced some serious concern and opposition to the deal as well. Austria remains on that track. That's a much smaller country, though. So France and Poland would still need one of the big countries. Germany's not going to do it. German industry loves this deal as much as they're going to love any developments around the world right now. Spain is heavily present in Brazil, Argentina, and the Mercosur countries, Latin America in general. They're not going to oppose it. Italy is the big question. Where does Giorgia Meloni go with this, considering her newfound position as maybe the most influential person in Europe and probably one of the most influential people around the world? Von der Leyen and the EU Commission at large is putting a lot of effort in this push. This is really the first thing that the new commission is delivering. This is what they see as the most important thing for the new commission that has just started to deliver for Europe in the world. So expect this to be something of a battle, but at least the trade element will only need ratification from the European Council, represented by EU country trade ministers, and this 35% requirement for blocking the deal, as well as then support in ratification in the European Parliament, which should be forthcoming. The European Parliament traditionally has been an incredibly pro-trade body and sees the sort of strategic benefits and simply the ability to have a say in developments in other countries. One of the things that we've seen with this agreement that's really quite revolutionary is that Europe itself in the past has not allowed trade agreements to set any boundaries on European regulation going forward. But in this case, the trade agreement includes something of a rebalancing mechanism, which is a huge win, especially for Brazil, because this basically allows Mercosur countries, if they feel that they're being hit by European extraterritorial legislation and regulation, they can come back and say, by the way, this is a forestry directive, carbon border adjustment mechanism. These are hitting us hard. These go against the purpose and objective of this trade agreement. How are we going to settle this? Because you can't be doing this to us. Any EU regulation, any EU law that Mercosur countries think or see affecting them somehow, they are now up for debate. And this is a major change in the way that the EU sees itself.
Lauri, Bolivia recently joined Mercosur. However, it's my understanding that this agreement will be with the original 4 members of Mercosur and the EU. How is that going to work now that Bolivia is a part of the Mercosur, especially given earlier concerns about the agreement having to do with deforestation? Bolivia is the country in South America with the highest rate of deforestation at the moment.
Yeah, so this is one of the functions of not wanting to open up the entire agreement that was completed once in 2019. The fact that Bolivia has now joined and Mercosur has had something a revolving cast as well. I mean, Venezuela was, on the doorstep and even inside for a little bit, now no longer. So it has to do with the nature of Mercosur that's not as integrationist as the EU is. But it's a really sort of interesting question because obviously if we look at countries that have incredibly high deforestation rates, have a very strong PRC presence, and at the same time would have a lot of minerals that it might share with the world, Bolivia should be very high on that list on all those counts. So Europe, if it really wants to help other countries diversify away from China dependence, Bolivia should be brought on board as quickly as possible. It's also a country where the EU could have a major impact when it comes to preventing deforestation. So I think it just means that there are some open questions going forward. This agreement will be between Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil on one hand, and then on the other hand, the EU as a whole. But going forward, it leaves something on Brussels' agenda. I see no reason why they should not push quite quickly also to have Bolivia included. And that would then bring sort of broader strategic benefits, I think, for the West as a whole.
Laura, you've mentioned China already in some of your responses, but I want to bring in the geopolitical lens now to this agreement because an agreement of this size cannot help but have geopolitical ramifications, especially given the rising interest in China's trade and economic footprint throughout the Southern Cone. In your opinion, does the EU-MERCOSUR deal act as a kind of counterweight to China's influence in the region? What implications could this have for Paraguay in particular, a country that we don't often pay that much attention to, which remains the only diplomatic ally of Taiwan in South America, despite persistent pressure from the PRC to change sides?
This is a really important question. It's a way of thinking about how can a trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur have a direct impact also in U.S. policy on Taiwan, U.S. policy of Latin America, U.S. policy vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. So Paraguay, because it does not recognize Beijing, but recognizes Taipei, has to jump through all kinds of different hoops to be able to trade with China in the first place. So a lot of this trade goes via Argentina, a lot of it goes through Brazil, and there are a lot of middlemen taking cuts along the way. Paraguay is a country that's generally growing fast. It has an improving rule of law. It has an improving regulatory environment. But to basically get to the next level, it needs to be able to do trade openly with the world, trade in ways that align with its diplomatic positions. This is an incredibly important deal for Paraguay to be able to do so. As you well know, Ryan, in the last election, this EU-MERCOSUR deal was a major topic in Paraguay. Current President Santiago Peña banked a lot on this deal going through, made a lot of promises along the way. So Santiago Peña is very committed to this. And if the United States and other friends of Paraguay want to see existing policy continued regarding the recognition of Taiwan and not China, this is probably the most important thing for that policy to continue. Simply having alternative export markets for Paraguay that it can openly engage in without having to have its trade run Argentina or Brazil, and with Argentinians or Brazilians taking a major cut in the process, more so than the transportation of their goods would require. Another thing that, often comes up is the question of Brazil's Amazon and the future thereof. I mean, what this deal does do, it gives Europeans a direct stake in farming in Brazil, in the different kinds of farming practices, where the meat Europeans import comes from. And this has been a major issue because China hasn't been asking a whole lot of questions about the kinds of conditions in which the soy that they import, the meat that they import comes from Brazil. So anything to turn the dial a little bit there will make a major difference along the way. Not that China is going to disappear anywhere. China needs the food and resources of Brazil even more so than Europe does. But simply having somewhere else to turn will be very important going forward.
We're recording this podcast about 2 weeks before the inauguration of President-elect Trump in the United States. And so I think we need to also talk about the incoming administration in the US and some of its promises to use the instrument of tariffs, including on some countries in Latin America, as well as a view of trade in the incoming administration that, well, it remains to be seen, could potentially be not in favor of increasing market access to some of our partners in South America. So how important will this deal be, Lauri, for the two markets in the event that the United States incoming administration adopts an approach that does not favor increased access to U.S. markets and potentially uses the instrument of tariffs against countries in Latin America?
Yes, I mean, there's definitely an element here that's not only about China, and Europeans have shifted on this quite a bit in recent years, and now Europeans increasingly don't think of China as a friendly nation. This has a lot to do, obviously, with support for Russia in Russia's war against Ukraine. In the case of many Mercosur countries, there are still strong bodies of opinion that do think of China as more as a friend. But still, when it comes to protecting themselves from China, they see themselves as protecting their economies and their trade from less than friendly competition. In the case of the United States, there's something different going on here. I think both parties are sort of bracing themselves. The estimates, when I speak to people in Brasilia, when I speak to people in Brussels, estimates on what might be coming and the impact, they vary greatly. Let's just say that the common thread is that very few people expect a positive impact. It's really quite worrisome when you talk to trade people, whether it's in Brasilia, whether it's in Brussels, because many of them wonder whether it's possible for the United States now in a more geopolitically competitive world to reimagine trade in a way that would at least favor the friends of Washington, friends of the United States. That as Washington starts to think about raising tariffs, that there's some consideration given, for example, to the ability of allies to arm up and defend themselves, to develop the kind of industry that would allow that to happen. Obviously, this EU-MERCOSUR deal is looking at buttressing the industries of both parties. Lula in Brazil has a great interest in reindustrializing Brazil. Germans, Italians, French, Spanish, the Polish, they want to make sure that Europe remains something of an industrial powerhouse. So the extent to which Washington can aid friends and allies with that objective, I think that would be sort of greatly appreciated. But it's absolutely true that the worries abound. And sometimes I worry that results in not even offering policies towards Washington that might be of interest to Washington as well, including for the new administration. Then again, the last 4 years, when it comes to the real results of the Biden administration's policy towards Brazil or the Biden administration's policy towards Europe, it's not like these friends and allies and trading partners necessarily see a whole lot of positive impact either. So we're starting from a relatively low plane either way.
I want to zoom out and look at the deal within broader EU strategy toward Latin America. It's something we've been paying increasing amount of attention to because I think it's something that Europe has been paying increasing amount of attention to. The EU has shown an increasing interest, frankly, in Latin America. And when Spain had the rotating presidency of the European Union, this, I think, was catalyzed even further. And so the question that I have is, how should we see this trade deal in the broader sets of agreements that the European Union has sought to forge with Latin America? And in particular, we saw a pretty significant EU-CELAC summit in 2024, again, when Spain was heading the rotating presidency. How should we understand the Mercosur agreement as part of these efforts? What are Europe's core objectives when it comes to engagement with Latin America?
I think returning to the stage is the core objective. When these negotiations started in 1999, you look at the amount of trade between EU and Mercosur, it was much, much higher. At the time, over 25% of Mercosur exports went to the European Union. That went down to under 15 at one point. Now it's above again. The core objective is returning to the stage. And this has to do with the fact that Europe has lost a lot of markets. Obviously, the resources of Russia are one major loss, but also increasing closure of other markets that includes China. The hopes on TTIP, those washed away about a decade ago. We're really looking at Europe reawakening to the fact that Latin America exists. and that there's tremendous potential. The Chile agreement I already mentioned, it's also the updating of the agreement with Mexico. Europeans are also looking at the U.S. nearshoring destinations, whether it's the Dominican Republic, whether it's Panama, whether it's Costa Rica, looking at what they can do in these countries. Also to be able to export within Latin America, but also to the United States. So I think there's a sort of broad reawakening taking place, really starting all the way from Mexico, coming to Chile. But the grand prize is this EU-MERCOSUR agreement. Increasingly, Europe feels that it has a lack of friends in the world. And through this process, hopefully, Brazil especially will emerge as a closer partner on the world stage. Brazil being a country that is obviously deeply embedded in structures such as the BRICS, even the expanded BRICS, but also one country that has been very committed to upholding a rules-based international order. Europe sees itself as looking for partners. And when it looks around the world, it sees a lot of Latin American countries that agree on those basic principles. So that is maybe a slightly high-level answer, but I think that's what's really in the background once we start looking beyond the potential billions and the business opportunities and even just the resources. Europe feels that it has fewer partners, and now Latin America is recovering a position that it had maybe 25, 30 years ago.
Lauri, this has been an incredibly wide-ranging conversation, but I want to ask you as an exit question, if there's anything that we didn't cover, is there anything else that you would like to highlight or add?
I think the final thought that I would like to leave people with is that it's really a sort of question, an existential question for both Mercosur and the EU. Not saying that necessarily if this agreement doesn't happen, Mercosur falls apart. If this agreement is handled the wrong way in Europe, the EU falls apart. It doesn't necessarily need to work out that way. Maybe Mercosur is closer to that point than the EU. But this is really a sort of outgrowth of some of the most important settlements on both continents. Before Mercosur was founded in 1994, Brazil and Argentina had a really difficult relationship, one that included competition in the nuclear realm. And all of that's now a question of the past. As much as we marvel sometimes at the partisanships that happens between the presidencies of the two countries, we're still talking about a relatively unproblematic relationship. Similarly, I really hope that Paris and Berlin manage to figure this out in a way that helps fortress and buttress what's good about the European Union, its outlook towards the world, its willingness to conduct trade and sign and ratify trade agreements. If this agreement can fortify both of these blocs in positive ways and help them be their best possible selves, then this agreement should do much good to the world, not just necessarily to the parties involved.
Lauri Tähtinen, a non-resident senior associate with the CSIS Americas program, thanks for joining us on 35 West today. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Wonderful to be here.
For you, thank you for joining. Stay tuned for the next episode of 35 West.